Hey everybody, wanted to go over cross E a little bit because I know we didn't have a chance to do that in class. And it's one of our more interesting crosses, and so we wanted to spend just a moment talking about it. So for cross E, we told you that we had an albino female and a melanistic male. Please excuse my representations here. Hopefully you guys like it. Hopefully you guys like them. I know they're not perfect, but you get the idea. So if this is the cross we had, these are also the offspring that it looks like we had. We had about equal numbers of wild types represented by our first column here, golden albinos, albinos, and melanistics. So again, we had two parents and we had 4 different types of offspring, which is usually an interesting thing. So see if we can explain it using some of our Punnett squares. So let's break this down a little bit in terms of melanin and erytophores. If we talk about our axolotls that were able to produce melanin in terms of the offspring, about half of them were able to make melanin. All of the wild types and all of the melanistics. This isn't bad for us because one of our parents was able to make melanin as well. So that parent must have given that gene or that allele to half of his offspring. It makes sense that he's a heterozygote for melanin production, given that the other parent couldn't make melanin at all. We know that the albino parent was not able to make melanin, so homozygote recessive for melanin, then he must have been a heterozygote. If he was homozygous dominant, all of the offspring would have been producing melanin. And again, if he was homozygous recessive, he wouldn't have looked the way he did, and all of the offspring would have been non-melanin producing. So it makes sense that he's a heterozygote for it. So we're pretty sure we had possible cross 4 when it comes to melanin production. Half of the offspring could do it, half of them couldn't, because their father was a heterozygote for melanin production. Now when it comes to erytophores, half of our offspring were able to make erytophores as well. All of the wild types and all of the goldens were able to make erytophores. The albinos and the melanistics couldn't. And this means one of our parents had to give this gene to them as well. There's a problem with this, right? We told you that the original parents in this cross were a melanistic and an albino. And that just doesn't work because neither melanistics nor albinos are able to make melanin. They would essentially able to make erytophores. They're essentially homozygote recessive for both those characteristics. The melanistic can't do it, and neither can the albino. So it doesn't make sense that these are the right parents for this cross. Something has to be wrong. We had to make an error in identifying our parents. And so one of our parents, or both, were identified incorrectly. And so really there are 3 possibilities. One is one of our parents was melanistic, but the other parent, the female in this case, was a golden albino. Another possibility is that the male was a wild type and the female was a regular albino. Again, in these cases, you can see now where the erytophores come from. In the first option, it comes from the golden female. In the second option, it comes from the wild type male. Now, the third option is we could have misidentified both. We could have had a wild type male and a golden albino female. Assuming we weren't completely off and had both of the parents wrong on some level, where the melanin was off and the erytophores was off. These are the 3 reasonable mistakes we could have made. It's possible to mistake a melanistic for a wild type and possible to mistake a golden for an albino. It's pretty hard to mistake an albino for a melanistic or something. So given these different possibilities, which one did we actually have? Well, we can do a Punnett square with each of these potential crosses and see which ones make sense. So in this case, we would have a melanistic parent that is heterozygous for melanin and homozygote recessive for erytophores. Remember, he can't make erytophores. In the case of the other parent, homozygous recessive for melanin, can't make melanin, that's why it's an albino, but can make erytophores. And it'd be a heterozygote for that, otherwise all of the offspring would show erytophores, and that's not what we see. So here would be our Punnett square. The 2 possibilities for the male could make gametes with a dominant allele in the first characteristic and recessive in the second, or recessive for both. In the case of the golden female, could give recessive for the first and dominant for the second, or recessive for both. And so here are the 4 different offspring outcomes we could get. And if we color code them a little bit, we see that this fits out pretty much what we would expect. 1/4 of the offspring have a dominant allele for both, and therefore are wild types. 1/4 of them are dominant for melanin, but recessive for erytophores, or they'd be melanistics. 1/4 of them recessive for the first, but dominant for the second, in other words, Goldens, and a quarter would be albinos. And this is consistent with what we saw. We had about equal numbers of each. So these could be the parents. This could be what we have, a melanistic parent and an albino parent, resulting in equal numbers of those different offspring. We have to look at the other crosses too to see if they work as well. We could have had a wild type and an albino. So let's see what we would have had there. So if we had a wild type and albino, the Punnett square looks a little bit different because we know the albino parent had to give a recessive gene for both alleles, but the wild type parent could have given one of 4 different possibilities. Dominant for both, dominant for one and not the other, dominant for the other and not the first, or recessive for both. And that would result in these possible crosses. And if we color code these again, we once again see that we get about a quarter of each different phenotype for the offspring. This again is consistent with what we saw. So this could be what we have too. We could have had a wild type parent and an albino parent. Now let's look at our third possibility where we could have had a wild type and a golden. So we misidentified both parents. If this were the case, this is what our Punnett square would look like. A little bit more complicated since one parent has 4 possibilities they could have given and the other parent 2. And if we do a color coding of this, we see that 3/8 of our possibilities are wild types, 3/8 are golden, and only 1/8 melanistic and 1/8 albino. This is kind of inconsistent with what we saw. Although we did see all 4, we saw them in equal numbers. And this is predicting we would see much more in terms of wild types and goldens than melanistics and albinos. Now, that's not exactly what we saw. So even though this is possible, it's somewhat unlikely. And it's unlikely to me for 2 reasons. One, we would have had to misidentify both parents. And that means we screwed up twice. As much of a mess as I am, I probably only screwed up once. And so my guess, and not only that, the ratios of the offspring would have to just be off too. So I'm fairly confident we didn't mess up twice and see ratios that we were not predicting. Which of the other 2 makes the most sense? Well, again, either one of them would have worked. My guess is what we had was a wild type parent and an albino parent, simply because I think it's a lot easier to mistake a wild type for a melanistic than it is an albino for a golden. But either one of those outcomes could work, and I think either one of them explain our results pretty well. But that explains cross E and our misidentification of the parents. So when you do your Punnett squares, what I would suggest you do is do one with a wild type parent and albino and explain the ratios of the offspring that we have. Good luck. Let me know if you have questions.